The thing about security duty on diplomatic stations, Lucas Hayes had learned over 3 months of providing military support for negotiations he wasn't senior enough to fully understand, was that it involved long periods of careful vigilance, punctuated by brief moments of intense concern about whether you just witnessed something that would create interstellar incidents. He'd spent most of his deployment managing defensive perimeter maintenance, coordinating with station security about patrol schedules, and generally trying to keep the 3rd Security Battalion's assigned sectors running smoothly, while diplomats conducted their negotiations in heavily guarded conference rooms. The work was important but not particularly exciting, checking sensor arrays, verifying access protocols, ensuring that defensive systems remained operational without being conspicuous enough to make visiting delegations nervous about humanity's military capabilities. Lucas had been good at it, maintaining the kind of reliable competence that earned him responsibility without attracting the attention that came with either spectacular success or catastrophic failure. His current shift had been longer than usual, 16 hours coordinating emergency maintenance, after one of the station's defensive grid modules had shown anomalous readings that turned out to be calibration error rather than actual malfunction. By the time he'd verified that every system was functioning properly and filed the appropriate reports, he was exhausted in ways that made his standard 8-hour shifts seem relaxing by comparison. He'd returned to his quarters in the military residential section with exactly one goal: sleep for as many hours as duty schedule allowed before his unit's redeployment in 8 hours. The quarters themselves were standard military accommodation, small but functional, equipped with bunk, storage, basic hygiene facilities, and just enough space to exist without feeling claustrophobic. Lucas had personalized the space minimally during his 3-month assignment, adding a few photos from home and some books he'd been meaning to read but hadn't found time for. He'd been stripping off his duty uniform and preparing to collapse into his bunk when someone knocked on his door with uncertain rhythm that suggested hesitation rather than official business. Lucas's immediate instinct was to ignore it. He was off duty, exhausted, and whoever was knocking could probably find someone else to handle whatever minor issue had emerged. But years of military courtesy and his parents' emphasis on basic decency meant he couldn't quite bring himself to leave someone standing in the corridor if they needed help. He'd pulled his shirt back on, opened the door expecting another soldier or possibly a station official with administrative requirement, and instead found himself looking at an avari who was very definitely not supposed to be in the military residential section. The recognition had been immediate. Lucas had spent enough time around avari diplomatic personnel to identify the species instantly, and the formal robes and elaborate facial markings indicated high-ranking status even before his brain caught up with the specific details. The avari stood in his doorway looking distressed in ways that transcended species boundaries. Bioluminescent patterns showing colors that his cultural briefings had indicated meant confusion or anxiety. Posture carrying the careful tension of someone trying to maintain composure while dealing with situation they hadn't expected. Lucas's brain had cycled through approximately 5 different responses in the space of 3 seconds. Concern about protocol violations, awareness that he was probably looking at someone politically important, recognition that she was clearly in some kind of trouble, calculation about what complications might emerge, and underlying all of it, the simple human reaction to someone who appeared lost and distressed. The decency had won. He'd stepped back from the doorway, gestured for her to enter, and spoken in the careful standard he'd been practicing. "Come in. You look like you're lost and possibly in some kind of trouble. Let me help." The avari had hesitated, clearly evaluating whether entering a stranger's quarters was safe, then stepped inside with visible relief. Lucas had closed the door to provide privacy, and to avoid having anyone walk past and see an Avari royal in a human soldier's quarters, which would create exactly the kind of attention neither of them needed. "I'm Sergeant Lucas Hayes, 3rd Security Battalion," he'd said, trying to project calm competence while his brain worked through how to handle this situation. "I'm guessing you're not supposed to be in the military residential section, and I'm guessing you're probably important enough that people are looking for you. Are you hurt, in immediate danger? Do you need me to contact your security detail?" The Avari's bioluminescent patterns had shifted into configuration Lucas couldn't interpret, and she'd spoken in accented but clear standard. "I am not injured. I am lost. I was attempting to reach the sanctuary chambers where members of the royal delegation may seek private meditation. I followed directions provided by station navigation system, but I believe the translation protocols contained errors. This is clearly not a sanctuary chamber." Lucas had processed that explanation and arrived at several conclusions about navigation errors, security protocols that apparently hadn't prevented an Avari royal from wandering into restricted sections, and the immediate practical reality that he had a lost princess in his quarters who needed help regardless of what diplomatic complications might emerge. The sanctuary chambers are in the diplomatic residential section, about 3 corridors from here through areas that require different security clearance than you apparently have, he'd explained. "I can escort you there, or I can contact your security detail and have them collect you. Or if you need a few minutes to compose yourself before dealing with official explanations about how you ended up lost, you're welcome to sit here until you're ready." He gestured toward his small seating area, 1 chair and a footlocker, aware that he was offering incredibly inadequate accommodations to someone who probably lived in palace and was accustomed to far more comfortable surroundings. "I don't have much to offer in terms of hospitality, but I have water. I have a quiet space where no one will disturb you for at least a few minutes, and I have no interest in making your situation more complicated than it already is. Whatever you need, I'll help if I can." The princess, because Lucas was increasingly certain that's what she was based on her markings and the quality of her robes, had looked at him with expression he couldn't quite read, her bioluminescent patterns shifting through several configurations, before settling into something that might have been surprise or assessment. She'd sat carefully in the chair, and Lucas had grabbed water from his small supply and offered it to her with instinctive courtesy. "Thank you," she'd said, accepting the water with the kind of careful grace that suggested formal training in diplomatic protocol. "I am Princess Lyra, daughter of Queen Sithara of the Avari Queendom, and you are correct that my presence in the military residential section will create complications once my security detail realizes I'm missing from the diplomatic areas." Lucas had felt his stomach drop slightly at the confirmation that he was providing informal sanctuary to actual royalty, but he'd committed to helping and wasn't about to reverse course, just because the situation was more politically significant than he'd hoped. "Well, Princess Lyra, you're welcome to stay here as long as you need," he'd said, trying to project calm while internally calculating what his commanding officers were going to say when this inevitably came to their attention. "I'm scheduled for redeployment in about 8 hours, so I was planning to sleep, but that can wait if you need someone to talk to or if you want company while you figure out your next steps." Lyra's bioluminescent patterns had shifted again, and she'd spoken with something that sounded like genuine curiosity. "You offer assistance without asking what benefits such assistance might provide you, without seeking to leverage this encounter for political advantage or social advancement. That is unusual in my experience with those who learn my identity. I offer assistance because you're a person who needed help and I was available to provide it," Lucas had replied, too tired to perform sophisticated diplomatic language. "The fact that you're a princess doesn't change the basic calculation that helping people who are lost or distressed is the decent thing to do. Any political implications are someone else's problem to worry about, My job right now is just making sure you're safe and helping you get where you're trying to go." He'd pulled the footlocker over to use as seat, maintaining respectful distance while being close enough for conversation. "Though I am curious how you ended up in the military section. Our security protocols are supposed to prevent unauthorized access between residential zones." Lyra had looked slightly embarrassed, her patterns shifting into colors that Lucas was starting to recognize as the Avari equivalent of sheepish admission. "I may have borrowed security credentials from one of my attendants, and then followed navigation directions that I now understand were formatted for human visual processing rather than Avari spatial interpretation. The combination resulted in me bypassing security checkpoints while heading in completely wrong direction. So you deliberately avoided your security escort and then got lost following bad directions." Lucas had tried not to smile. "That's honestly impressive in its own way, though I'm guessing your security detail is going to be less amused when they figure out what happened." "They will be extremely unamused, and my mother will be." Displeased is insufficient term. Furious might be more accurate. Lyra had sipped the water he'd provided. "But I needed space away from constant supervision, away from the performance that diplomatic functions require. I thought the sanctuary chambers would provide that privacy, but instead I found your door." She'd looked around his quarters with curiosity. "This is very different from palace accommodations. Small, functional. No decorative elements beyond those photographs and books. You live like this regularly." "This is actually relatively comfortable by military standards," Lucas had said. "I've had assignments where quarters were shared bunks in converted cargo spaces. This is private room with actual door and personal storage. That's luxury in frontier military service. You find this luxurious." Lyra's tone had suggested she was trying to understand a completely foreign concept. "What I would consider barely adequate basic accommodation, you consider generous provision." "Different contexts create different standards," Lucas had replied. "I'm sure what you consider normal living conditions would seem incredibly elaborate to me. Doesn't make either perspective wrong, just reflects different experiences and expectations." They'd sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and Lucas had found himself relaxing despite the surreal situation. The princess didn't seem to expect constant entertainment or elaborate courtesy. She was just sitting in his quarters recovering from her navigation misadventure and apparently appreciating the quiet space he'd offered. "Can I ask you something?" Lyra had said eventually. "Sure." "Why did you help me? Before you knew my identity, before you understood the political implications. You saw a lost Avari in your doorway, and your immediate response was to offer assistance and sanctuary. That suggests either remarkable compassion or remarkable naivete about how such encounters usually proceed." Lucas had considered the question seriously. "Probably both. I helped because you looked distressed, and I don't like seeing people in distress when I can do something about it. And I probably didn't fully think through the political implications before inviting you into my quarters, which suggests some naivete about diplomatic protocols." He'd paused. "But I don't think I'd change the choice even knowing the complications. You needed help. I was available to help. Everything else is secondary to that basic reality." Lyra's bioluminescent patterns had shifted into something that looked almost like wonder, and she'd been opening her mouth to respond when urgent knocking interrupted. The kind of official pounding that suggested security personnel who'd located their missing charge and weren't particularly happy about where they'd found her. Lucas had opened the door to find 3 Avari guards whose bioluminescent patterns were showing colors he didn't need a cultural briefing to interpret as alarm and anger, along with one very concerned-looking human security officer who'd apparently been called in to coordinate the search. "Princess Lyra," the lead Avari guard had said with barely controlled fury, "your absence was noted 17 minutes ago. We have been searching the entire diplomatic section. How did you come to be in military quarters with unauthorized human personnel? I got lost following faulty navigation data. Lyra had replied with the kind of calm that suggested royal training in maintaining composure during uncomfortable situations. Sergeant Hayes provided assistance when I arrived at his door in distress. He has been nothing but courteous and helpful, and I will not have him blamed for my navigation errors or my choice to seek privacy away from constant supervision. The guards had looked like they wanted to argue, but apparently contradicting a princess was above their authority level. The human security officer had given Lucas a look that clearly communicated, "We're going to have a very long conversation about this later," but had simply said, "Sergeant Hayes, you'll need to file an incident report and make yourself available for debriefing." "Understood, sir," Lucas had replied, already mentally composing the report that would somehow have to explain how an Avari princess had ended up in his quarters, without making it sound like either incompetence or deliberate protocol violation. Lyra had stood, preparing to leave with her security detail, but had paused at the doorway. "Thank you, Sergeant Hayes, for the water, for the quiet space, and for treating me with simple kindness rather than performing elaborate courtesy or seeking advantage. That is rarer than you might expect." Then she'd been gone, swept away by her security detail, and Lucas had been left standing in his quarters trying to process what had just happened and wondering what complications would emerge from his instinctive decision to help a lost princess who'd knocked on the wrong door. He'd filed the incident report as requested, been debriefed by his commanding officer, who'd been remarkably understanding about the situation, while making it clear that Lucas should probably avoid any further action. Princess Lyra returned to the diplomatic residential section, surrounded by her security detail, and already preparing for the conversation with her mother that would inevitably follow her unauthorized excursion. The Avari queendom placed enormous cultural significance on protocol and proper behavior, especially for members of the royal family, whose actions reflected on the entire civilization. Disappearing from designated areas without security escort, bypassing access controls through borrowed credentials, and ending up in military quarters with human personnel. These were not minor protocol violations, but significant breaches that would require explanation. What Lyra hadn't anticipated was how her mother would interpret the encounter once the full details emerged. The Avari had evolved as social predators, whose survival had depended on accurately reading intent and assessing character in potential allies, potential threats, and potential prey. That evolutionary history had given them sophisticated ability to process microexpressions, autonomic responses, and behavioral patterns, developing cultural frameworks that treated accidental encounters as fate-driven tests of character rather than random chance. The cultural belief held that how someone responded to unexpected situations, especially situations involving vulnerability or need, revealed their true nature more clearly than any amount of careful performance during planned interactions. Formal diplomatic exchanges were useful for establishing political relationships, but accidental encounters where people couldn't prepare responses or calculate advantages, those were considered genuine windows into character. When Queen Sithara learned that her daughter had gotten lost and ended up at a human soldier's quarters, her immediate concern had been for Lyra's safety. When she learned the details of how the encounter had proceeded, the soldier's instinctive courtesy, his offer of sanctuary without asking for compensation or advantage, his prioritization of Lyra's welfare over political implications, her interpretation shifted from security concern to cultural assessment. The station's sensors had recorded the encounter, standard monitoring that diplomatic sections maintained for security purposes. The Queen had reviewed those recordings with her senior advisors, analyzing every detail of the interaction between her daughter and the human sergeant. What they'd observed had been remarkable by Avari standards. The human had shown no deception in his autonomic responses. His heart rate had remained steady. His microexpressions had indicated genuine concern rather than calculated performance. His body language had conveyed protective instinct rather than predatory interest or political opportunism. He'd offered help without asking what he would receive in return, had provided space and resources without seeking to leverage the encounter for advantage, had maintained respectful behavior despite being alone with an attractive young royal who was technically in his power. This human demonstrated Karath, one of the senior advisors had observed, using an Avari term that didn't translate cleanly into standard but roughly meant protective care offered to vulnerable persons without expectation of reciprocal benefit. It was quality highly valued in Avari culture, considered foundational to trustworthy character and essential for anyone who would be given responsibility for others' welfare. He showed Karath to our daughter when he had no reason to expect his behavior was being observed or recorded, Queen Sithara had agreed. When power wasn't watching, when political advantage could have been claimed, when simple indifference would have been understandable, he chose kindness. That choice reveals character more clearly than any amount of diplomatic performance. The cultural implications were significant enough that Queen Sithara had requested formal meeting with human diplomatic leadership, ostensibly to discuss an incident involving her daughter and human military personnel. The human delegation had arrived at the meeting prepared for damage control, ready to apologize for whatever protocol violation had occurred, and assure the Queen that appropriate disciplinary action would be taken. Instead, the Queen had surprised them by requesting formal commendation for Sergeant Hayes, explaining that his behavior during the accidental encounter had demonstrated exactly the qualities the Avari valued most in potential allies and partners. Your soldier treated my daughter with kindness when he had no audience to impress, no authority to please, no advantage to gain, the Queen had said. That reveals more about human character than months of carefully managed diplomatic negotiations. If humanity produces soldiers who respond to vulnerable strangers with instinctive protective care, then humanity can be trusted in ways that military capability or economic power alone could never establish. The human delegation had been visibly surprised by this interpretation, having expected censure rather than commendation. But they'd accepted the Queen's assessment and agreed to recognize Sergeant Hayes for his diplomatic conduct, while privately wondering what exactly had happened during the encounter that had created such positive impression. Lucas himself had known none of this when his commanding officer had summoned him 3 days after the incident, informing him that his redeployment was being delayed and that he was required to attend a formal diplomatic function at the Queen's personal request. "I don't understand, sir," Lucas had said, feeling increasingly concerned about what complications had emerged. "Am I being disciplined for the protocol violation? Because I filed a complete incident report, and I'm prepared to accept responsibility for any infractions." "You're not being disciplined, Sergeant. You're being commended." His commanding officer had looked amused. "Apparently your instinct to help a lost princess has created unexpectedly positive diplomatic outcomes. The Queen wants to formally recognize your conduct, and refusing her invitation would itself be a diplomatic incident. So you're attending the reception, you're accepting whatever recognition she offers, and you're representing humanity with the same basic decency you showed when you invited Princess Lyra into your quarters." The reception had been exactly the kind of elaborate formal function that Lucas usually avoided: carefully arranged seating, ceremonial presentations, diplomatic observers from multiple species, all watching to see what political implications would emerge. Lucas had attended in his dress uniform, feeling conspicuous and uncomfortable while trying to remember which fork to use and which cultural gestures might cause offense to which species. Princess Lyra had been present, seated near her mother on the raised dais reserved for Avari royalty, and when their eyes had met across the room, she'd smiled with what looked like genuine warmth rather than diplomatic courtesy. Her bioluminescent patterns had shifted into colors that Lucas was starting to recognize, as indicating pleased recognition. The formal commendation had been brief but significant, Queen Sithara speaking about the importance of Karath, about how character revealed itself most clearly in unplanned moments, about humanity's demonstration through one soldier's instinctive kindness, that they could be trusted as genuine allies rather than just strategic partners. Lucas had received a formal medallion indicating recognition by the Avari royal house, and had managed to deliver brief acceptance speech that thanked the queen for her generosity while feeling completely out of his depth. After the formal ceremony concluded and the reception shifted to more casual social interaction, Princess Lyra had approached him with 2 glasses of something that her bioluminescent patterns suggested was safe for human consumption. "Congratulations on your commendation," she'd said, offering him one of the glasses. "Though I suspect you're wondering what exactly you're being commended for, since from your perspective you simply offered help to someone who was lost." "That's pretty much exactly what I'm wondering," Lucas had admitted. "Your mother spoke about Karath and character assessment and diplomatic significance, but I'm not sure I understand how offering you water and a chair translates to being recognized as demonstrating humanity's trustworthiness." "Among my people, accidental encounters are considered fate-driven tests of character," Lyra had explained. "We believe that how someone responds when they can't prepare, when there's no audience to impress, when simple indifference would be understandable, that reveals their true nature. You responded to finding a lost Avari in your doorway with instinctive protective care. You offered sanctuary without asking what you'd receive in return. You prioritized my welfare over political implications or personal convenience." She'd paused. "The station's sensors recorded our entire encounter. My mother and her advisors analyzed every detail of your autonomic responses, your micro-expressions, your behavioral patterns. They found no deception, no calculation, no attempt to leverage the situation for advantage. Just genuine concern for a stranger in distress and willingness to help without expectation of benefit. That combination is rare enough that my mother considers it significant indicator of your character, and by extension, humanity's reliability as allies." Lucas had processed this explanation, while trying to manage the discomfort of learning that his private interaction had been recorded and analyzed by Avari leadership. "So I'm being recognized for basic human decency. You're being recognized for demonstrating Karath, protective care offered to vulnerable persons without expectation of reciprocal benefit. It's quality my people value highly because it indicates trustworthiness in ways that political negotiation or strategic alliance never quite achieves." Lyra's bioluminescent patterns had shifted into configuration that looked almost mischievous. "Also, my mother is pleased that I inadvertently tested human character through my navigation errors, even though she's still quite angry that I bypassed my security detail to go wandering around the station." They talked for another hour, Lucas gradually relaxing as he realized that Lyra was genuinely interested in conversation, rather than just performing diplomatic courtesy. She'd asked about his military service, his family, his experiences during the deployment. He'd asked about Avari culture, about what it was like growing up as princess, about her own interests beyond the formal diplomatic role. By the time the reception concluded, Lucas had formed what felt like the beginning of actual friendship rather than just diplomatic acquaintance. And he'd noticed that Lyra's bioluminescent patterns consistently showed colors that his limited cultural knowledge suggested indicated pleased engagement. "I hope we can continue this conversation," Lyra had said as the reception wound down. "Though perhaps in less formal settings than diplomatic receptions, If you're remaining on the station for the extended negotiations, we could meet for more casual discussions. I'd like that, Lucas had replied, meaning it more than he'd expected to mean it. Though I should warn you that casual conversation with me involves a lot of questions about things I don't understand, since I'm still learning about Avari culture and diplomatic protocols. Good, I enjoy questions. They're more interesting than the elaborate courtesies that most people perform when they learn I'm a princess. Lyra had smiled. Besides, asking questions is considerably more respectful than pretending to understand things you don't. It suggests genuine interest in learning, rather than just performing appropriate diplomatic behavior. They'd arranged to meet again, ostensibly for cultural exchange. That would help Lucas better understand the Avari perspective, while giving Lyra opportunity for conversations that weren't entirely scripted by protocol. What neither of them had quite acknowledged yet was that the meetings were also becoming something more personal, driven by genuine mutual interest rather than just diplomatic duty or cultural curiosity. The wrong door that Princess Lyra had knocked on, the navigation error that had led her to a tired soldier's quarters instead of sanctuary chambers, was beginning to look less like mistake and more like the fate-driven encounter that Avari culture considered it to be. Over the following 3 months, Luca's and Lyra's regular meetings evolved from formal cultural exchange to genuine friendship characterized by the kind of honest conversation that both found refreshing compared to their usual carefully managed interactions. They'd meet in various neutral locations around the diplomatic station: observation lounges, botanical gardens, quiet cafeterias during off-peak hours, places where they could talk without constant attention from security details or diplomatic observers. Lucas learned about Avari cultural frameworks, about the evolutionary history that had shaped their ability to read intent beneath behavior, about the complex political dynamics that Lyra navigated as heir to the queendom. She explained the concept of Kareth in more detail, describing how Avari society placed enormous value on protective care offered without expectation of reciprocal benefit, how that quality was considered foundational to trustworthy character. When you offered me sanctuary that first night, you demonstrated Kareth without knowing you were doing it, she'd explained during one of their conversations. That's why it was so significant to my mother and her advisors. You weren't performing behavior you thought would impress us. You were just being yourself, responding instinctively to someone in distress. That authenticity is what made the encounter meaningful. Lyra learned about human military culture, about Lucas's childhood in a small agricultural community on one of humanity's frontier colonies, about the practical philosophy that had led him to military service, and then to diplomatic security assignments. She was fascinated by his descriptions of human social structures, the way communities formed around shared work rather than strict hierarchical arrangements, the value placed on individual initiative and personal responsibility. Your species seems remarkably comfortable with ambiguity and improvisation, she'd observed. Avari culture emphasizes careful planning and adherence to established protocols. You describe situations where humans just figure it out as they go, trusting individual judgment rather than waiting for official guidance. We do that a lot, Lucas had agreed. Sometimes because official guidance doesn't exist for novel situations. Sometimes because we trust that people on the ground can make better decisions than distant authority. Sometimes because we value the ability to adapt more than the comfort of knowing exactly what's expected. What surprised Lucas most was discovering how much he enjoyed conversations with someone whose perspective was so fundamentally different from his own. Lyra challenged his assumptions about authority, about social responsibility, about the relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare. Her questions made him think more carefully about things he'd always taken for granted, forced him to articulate values he'd never quite examined explicitly. And what surprised Lyra was discovering how much she valued Lucas's straightforward honesty, his willingness to admit when he didn't know something, his refusal to perform expertise he didn't possess. Most people in her life, advisors, courtiers, diplomatic personnel, approached conversations with her as political performance, carefully calculating what they said to advance their interests or avoid giving offense. Lucas just talked to her like she was a person he found interesting, asking questions and offering observations without apparent concern for how they might be politically interpreted. "You're remarkably unconcerned with saying the wrong thing," she'd noted during one conversation. "Most people are so careful around me, so concerned about potentially causing offense or damaging their relationship with the royal house. You just express your actual thoughts and trust that I'll either find them interesting or tell you if you've misunderstood something. I figure you'd rather have honest conversation than careful performance," Lucas had replied. "And if I say something genuinely offensive, you'll correct me and I'll learn from the mistake. Seems more useful than just never expressing any opinion that might possibly be wrong." Their friendship was noticed by both human and Avari diplomatic personnel, who viewed it with mixture of approval and concern. The approval came from those who saw the relationship as evidence of successful cross-cultural cooperation, proof that humans and Avari could form genuine connections beyond formal political alliance. The concern came from those who worried about political implications, about whether the relationship might create expectations or obligations that would complicate the careful diplomatic balance both sides were trying to maintain. Queen Sithara observed her daughter's friendship with the human soldier with interest that went beyond diplomatic calculation. She recognized in Lyra's bioluminescent patterns the signs of genuine affection and respect, saw the way her daughter's usual careful composure relaxed when she was preparing for one of her regular meetings with Lucas. And she noted that Lucas's behavior remained consistently Karath, protective care offered without expectation of advantage, genuine interest in Lyra's welfare that didn't seem driven by her political position. "Your friendship with the human sergeant appears to be developing into something more than cultural exchange," the Queen had observed during one of her private conversations with Lyra. "We enjoy each other's company," Lyra had replied, her bioluminescent patterns showing colors that indicated defensive acknowledgement. "He's interesting to talk to, and he treats me like a person rather than as a princess who needs to be carefully managed." "I'm not criticizing. I'm noting that you show bioluminescent patterns of genuine attachment, and that the human's autonomic responses when he's in your presence suggest reciprocal feelings even if he hasn't explicitly acknowledged them." Queen Sithara had smiled. "The accidental encounter that began your friendship may prove to have more lasting significance than either of you anticipated. You're suggesting romantic implications where simple friendship exists," Lyra had protested, though her bioluminescent patterns suggested she'd been considering exactly those implications herself. "I'm suggesting that Karath demonstrated consistently over time can develop into deeper bonds, and that the cultural differences between your species may be less significant obstacles than you fear." The Queen had paused. "But I'm also suggesting that if such development occurs, you'll need to be clear about your own intentions and willing to navigate the complexities that cross-species relationships inevitably create. Lyra had thought about that conversation repeatedly over the following weeks, paying closer attention to her own emotional responses during her meetings with Lucas, and recognizing that her feelings had evolved beyond simple friendship into something more complicated and more significant. But she was uncertain how to address those feelings, uncertain whether Lucas experienced similar attachment, and concerned about what complications might emerge if she acknowledged the shift from friendship to something deeper. The situation came to a head during a diplomatic crisis that required Lucas's security battalion to implement emergency protocols. A terrorist group opposed to human Avari cooperation had attempted to sabotage one of the station's critical systems, requiring immediate military response and temporary lockdown of all diplomatic sections. Lucas had been part of the response team, working 16-hour shifts to secure the station and investigate the sabotage, while Lyra and the other diplomatic personnel were confined to heavily guarded areas for their safety. The crisis lasted for 4 days, during which Lucas and Lyra had no direct contact despite both being aware of the other's situation. When the crisis was finally resolved and normal operations resumed, Lyra had gone directly to Lucas's quarters, the same quarters where their friendship had begun 3 months earlier, and knocked on his door with the kind of urgent intensity that suggested she'd been thinking about something important and needed to address it immediately. Lucas had opened the door looking exhausted from 4 days of crisis response, and his expression when he saw her had shifted through surprise, relief, and something that looked almost like joy before settling back into careful composure. "Lyra, I'm glad you're safe. I heard the diplomatic section was locked down for security reasons, but I didn't have details about whether anyone was directly threatened." "I'm fine. The security protocols were effective." Lyra had stepped into his quarters without waiting for invitation, and Lucas had closed the door behind her. "But I need to tell you something. And I need to tell you now before I convince myself that maintaining friendship without complications is safer than acknowledging what I've been feeling." Lucas had looked simultaneously hopeful and concerned, and Lyra had recognized in his micro-expressions that he understood what she was about to say even before she said it. "I have developed feelings for you that extend beyond friendship," she'd said, forcing herself to be direct despite the vulnerability that admission created. "Romantic feelings that I've been trying to ignore because cross-species relationships create enormous complications, and because I wasn't certain whether you experienced similar attachment. But these past 4 days, not knowing whether you were safe, worrying about the crisis while being unable to do anything useful, it made me realize that I care about you in ways that simple friendship doesn't quite capture." She'd paused, watching his reaction. "I'm not asking you to reciprocate if you don't feel the same way, but I needed to be honest about what I'm experiencing, even if it complicates our friendship or creates political difficulties." Lucas had been quiet for a moment, processing. Then he'd closed the distance between them and taken her hand with the same gentle care he'd shown when offering her water 3 months earlier. "I've been developing similar feelings," he'd admitted. "But I was trying not to acknowledge them because you're a princess and I'm a sergeant, because cross-species relationships are complicated, because I didn't want to presume that your interest in our friendship indicated romantic attachment. These past 4 days, working the crisis response while worrying about whether the diplomatic section was safe, whether you were safe, it made me realize that I care about you in ways that go beyond friendship too." Lyra's bioluminescent patterns had shifted into colors that Lucas had learned indicated joy and relief, and she'd smiled with genuine happiness. "So we're both developing romantic feelings that we've been trying not to acknowledge because we're concerned about complications and worried about presuming too much about the other's intentions." "Apparently, yes." Lucas had smiled back. which is probably the most human and Avari way possible to approach developing a relationship. Both of us overthinking the political implications instead of just acknowledging that we enjoy each other's company and want to explore where that might lead. So what do we do now? Lyra had asked. Because acknowledging mutual romantic interest is significantly easier than navigating what comes next, given the political realities and cultural differences. We take it slowly, Lucas had suggested. We continue spending time together. We have honest conversations about what we want and what concerns we have, and we figure out whether this is sustainable long-term relationship, or whether it's beautiful friendship that will eventually need to remain friendship, because the complications are too significant to overcome. That's remarkably sensible approach. I have my moments. Lucas had paused. Though I should warn you that if we're pursuing romantic relationship, we're going to have to tell people eventually, and that's going to create exactly the kind of political complications we've been trying to avoid. I'm aware. My mother will have opinions. Your commanding officers will have concerns. Various diplomatic personnel will worry about implications for the negotiations. Lyra's bioluminescent patterns had shown determination. But I'm willing to navigate those complications if you are, because I think what we're building might be worth the difficulty. They'd spent the rest of the evening talking about practical realities, how to maintain the relationship given their respective responsibilities, how to handle political scrutiny, what cultural differences they'd need to navigate, what they each needed from a partner. It was prosaic work that took some of the romance out of acknowledging mutual feelings, but it was also necessary foundation for building something sustainable, rather than just enjoying the initial excitement without considering long-term complications. By the time Lyra left his quarters that night, they'd established framework for exploring their relationship while being realistic about challenges they'd face. It wasn't perfect, wasn't without significant uncertainties, but it was 18 months after Princess Lyra knocked on the wrong door and found Lucas Hayes instead of sanctuary chambers. They stood together at a formal ceremony that marked the successful conclusion of human Avari diplomatic negotiations and the establishment of comprehensive alliance between their civilizations. The negotiations had produced frameworks for trade cooperation, mutual defense, cultural exchange, and political coordination that would shape both species' futures for generations. But the ceremony's most significant moment, according to many observers, wasn't the signing of formal treaties. It was Queen Sithara's announcement that her daughter had chosen to formalize bond with a human partner, and that this bond would be recognized as having same political and cultural significance as traditional Avari royal partnerships. 18 months ago, my daughter made what appeared to be simple navigation error, the Queen had said, addressing the assembled diplomatic corps and media representatives from dozens of species. She followed faulty translation protocols and ended up at quarters belonging to Sergeant Lucas Hayes of Humanity's 3rd Security Battalion. What could have been mere embarrassment became significant cultural moment when the human sergeant responded to my daughter's distress with instinctive care, protective care offered without expectation of benefit. She'd paused, allowing the cultural significance to register with the Avari delegation, while human translators ensured the concept was properly conveyed to non-Avari observers. That accidental encounter revealed character more clearly than months of formal diplomatic exchange could have achieved. It demonstrated that humanity produces individuals capable of genuine care for vulnerable strangers, individuals who prioritize others' welfare over personal advantage, even when no one is watching to reward such behavior. Queen Sithara had gestured toward Lucas and Lyra, standing together on the ceremonial platform. My daughter and Sergeant Hayes have spent the past 18 months building relationship based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared commitment to navigating the complexities that cross-species partnerships inevitably create. They have demonstrated that cultural differences, while significant, need not be insurmountable obstacles to meaningful connection. She'd smiled. Some will view this bond as political statement about human-avari cooperation. Others will see it as romantic relationship that transcends species boundaries. Both interpretations have merit, but I view it as validation of the principle that drove our negotiations from the beginning, that character matters more than credentials, that genuine care matters more than strategic positioning, and that accidental encounters can reveal truth more clearly than carefully managed diplomatic performances. The formal bonding ceremony that followed was a blend of human and avari traditions, carefully designed to honor both cultural frameworks while creating new hybrid practices that reflected the cross-species nature of the relationship. Lucas and Lyra exchanged vows that acknowledged both the personal commitment they were making and the broader symbolic significance that their bond carried for their respective civilizations. I choose you not because of political advantage or diplomatic necessity, but because you demonstrate Karath in every interaction, because you prioritize genuine connection over careful performance, and because building life with you seems more valuable than any comfort that avoiding cross-species complications might provide, Lyra had said during her formal vows. I choose you not because you're a princess or because our relationship serves political purposes, but because you challenge me to think more carefully about my assumptions, because you value honesty over flattery, and because the person you are matters more to me than any difficulty that cultural differences might create, Lucas had replied. The ceremony had been witnessed by representatives from 18 different species, broadcast across both human and avari territories, and analyzed extensively by political observers trying to determine what implications the royal bond would have for the broader alliance. But for Lucas and Lyra, the significance was more personal, formal recognition that what had begun with a wrong door and instinctive kindness had developed into committed partnership worth protecting despite the complications. The political implications were indeed significant. The bond between an avari princess and a human soldier became symbol of the alliance itself, concrete demonstration that cooperation between their species could extend beyond formal treaties into genuine personal connection. It influenced how both civilizations approached their relationship, creating cultural expectation that human-avari interactions should prioritize authentic engagement over purely strategic calculation. Lucas's military career took unexpected turn as he transitioned from security assignments to diplomatic liaison work, using his unique position as human bonded to Avari royalty to facilitate communication and cultural understanding between the species. It wasn't the career path he'd anticipated when he joined the military, but it was work that felt meaningful in ways that pure security duty never quite had. Lyra's role within the Avari political structure evolved as well, her bond with Lucas giving her perspective on human culture that proved valuable in navigating the complex dynamics of the alliance. She became advocate for policies that prioritized genuine partnership over hierarchical arrangements, drawing on her own experience of cross-species relationship to inform her political positions. 5 years after the Wrong Door incident, they attended a gathering celebrating the alliance's successful first phase implementation. Various officials gave speeches about trade growth, security cooperation, and cultural exchange programs that were bringing humans and Avari into closer contact across dozens of worlds. But the moment that would be most remembered was when a young Avari student asked Princess Lyra what advice she would give to others considering cross-species relationships, given the complications and cultural challenges such partnerships inevitably faced. I would tell them to remember that complications don't automatically mean something isn't worthwhile, Lyra had replied. My relationship with Lucas has required constant negotiation about cultural expectations, regular conversations about what we each need, and what compromises we're willing to make, ongoing effort to understand perspectives that don't come naturally to either of us. That effort is real and sometimes it's difficult. But the alternative, avoiding meaningful connection because it might be complicated, that seems like choosing safety over growth, comfort over genuine partnership. She'd paused. I would also tell them that the most important foundation for any relationship, cross-species or otherwise, is the kind of character that my mother calls karath. Genuine care for your partner's welfare that doesn't depend on receiving equivalent care in return. Lucas demonstrated that quality before he knew my identity, before he had any reason to expect that his kindness would be rewarded. That foundation of authentic care has sustained us through every difficulty we've encountered, because we both know that we prioritize each other's well-being over personal convenience or political advantage. Lucas had added his own perspective, and I would tell them that admitting when you don't understand something is more respectful than pretending to understand. I spent months asking Lyra questions about Avari culture, about why certain things mattered to her, about what she needed from a partner. Some of those questions probably seemed basic or obvious to her, but she appreciated that I was trying to actually learn rather than just assuming my human frameworks would be adequate for understanding her perspective. The conversation had continued for another hour, various people asking about specific challenges they'd navigated and how they'd approached situations where cultural differences created conflict. Both Lucas and Lyra had been honest about the difficulties, while emphasizing that genuine partnership required sustained effort regardless of whether the partners were from the same species or different ones. 10 years after the Wrong Door incident, Lucas and Lyra were recognized by both human and Avari leadership as having contributed significantly to the alliance's success through their willingness to model authentic cross-species partnership. The recognition came with various formal honors and increased responsibilities that both accepted with characteristic mixture of appreciation and slight discomfort, about being celebrated for what they considered simply building their lives together. But the recognition that mattered most to both of them came from Queen Sithara during a private family gathering, when she told them that she was proud of how they'd navigated the complexities of their relationship while maintaining the authentic care that had characterized their initial encounter. You chose each other based on character rather than calculating political advantage, the Queen had said. You've built partnership that honors both your cultural backgrounds while creating new hybrid practices that reflect your specific relationship. And you've demonstrated that cross-species bonds can be sustainable and meaningful when both partners prioritize genuine connection over comfortable familiarity. She'd smiled. The wrong door that my daughter knocked on turned out to be exactly the right door, because it led her to someone who demonstrated karath when there was no audience to impress and no advantage to gain. That foundation has sustained everything you've built together, and it will continue to sustain whatever challenges you face in the future. Lucas and Lyra had exchanged glances, their non-verbal communication having developed over a decade into the kind of subtle understanding that long-term partners achieve. They'd both been thinking about that first encounter, the exhausted soldier who'd opened his door to find a lost princess, the instinctive kindness that had led him to offer water and sanctuary without asking for anything in return, the choice to prioritize her welfare over his own convenience or the political complications he might have anticipated. That choice, made in a moment without calculation or careful consideration of consequences, had changed both their lives and had contributed to shaping the alliance between their civilizations. It had started with a wrong door, faulty navigation data, and one tired human's decision to help a stranger in distress. But it had become something much larger, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine care, a relationship that demonstrated the possibility of authentic connection across species boundaries, a foundation for broader cooperation between civilizations that had learned to trust each other partially, because two individuals had shown that such trust could be built one interaction at a time. The accidental encounter had become intentional relationship. The wrong door had led to the right partnership. And the simple act of offering kindness without expectation of reward had rippled through diplomatic negotiations, cultural frameworks, and political structures in ways that neither Lucas nor Lyra could have anticipated when they'd first met in the cramped quarters of a human soldier on a diplomatic station. Sometimes the most significant moments in history emerged from accidents, from navigation errors, from choices made without full awareness of their implications. And sometimes the best partnerships began not with careful courtship or strategic calculation, but with one person knocking on the wrong door and another person choosing to help despite having every reason to simply turn them away.